it spoke. It's fine. Hello and welcome to Table Talks 2, New Approaches to Romantic Studies and Society. I should begin with an apology, which is that I've messed up the time zones, meaning that some of you couldn't get in until possibly now, and hopefully you're all flooding in as I speak this, or maybe some of you will arrive at 7, but you can all catch up through this recording. Mea culpa, I'm an idiot. Anyway, I'm an idiot who's been funded to think about the romantic ridiculous. So this is all sort of part and parcel of my research project and indeed personal identity. So these, I'll speak about the rationale for this event in a moment, and I'll give a brief some brief information about my progress, which is part of what this is for, and then it will sort of turn into some lightning talks from these wonderful colleagues that you're going to hear from, and then there'll be an opportunity for us to speak together and have a chat. A woman announced to me that this workshop was being recorded, or this webinar was being recorded, but just a note again to say that it is being recorded, and anything you do say may be taken down in evidence of some sort or the other. Please tweet us if you use Twitter using #TableTalks. And thank you to those of you who found your way to us through telling me that it wasn't working on Twitter, and then I sent out the Zoom link. Hopefully we're not going to be Zoom bombed over the course of the evening. You can say hello in the chat, which a lot of you have been doing, and it's been exciting to see us already sort of talking about Anne Bronte, children's poetry, and some other things, at least some of which we're going to hear more of later this evening. And then there is a Q&A function, which is in the bar currently along the top of my computer, usually along the bottom of Zoom or Zoom webinar, where you can ask specific questions and answers. My plan, I've already spoken about being interested in the sort of organizational elements of Zoom webinar, where the speakers are given video and speaking privileges and the audience are turned into a list for us to look at. The Q&A, only you attendees can write questions to we panelists, and we can reply. I like having the Q&A as a sort of separate function to the chat, so that we can keep a track of the questions. If you write them in the chat, they tend to get swamped by lots of other people sort of talking and chatting and possibly starting to answer those questions, and they might not get spoken about directly. So please, any specific questions you have for all of us or a particular speaker, put in the Q&A. The chat sort of keep on having a conversation. You're welcome to do that. And then just because I'm sort of very much on Twitter, my Twitter handle is @drbeard79, and you can send rude messages about my incapabilities should you wish. So this is the title slide. It's got the post image that I've used for advertising, which is from James Gilray's Tales of Wonder. I liked it because it involves a table. I have a very simple mind, so table talks should have an image of people talking at a table, and I thought this one was said something also about society or sociability and sort of female friendship and the Gothic and all sorts of things, some of which we might want to speak about in the conversation later. So here we are. This is just this is my slide that I had in my first presentation. So if you were here for the first table talk in December, you'll be familiar with some of these bullet points, or you might hazily remember some of these bullet points. So the table talk event has been designed as progress markers for my Romantic Ridiculous project, but they're also opportunities for all of us panelists to share work in progress. And I sort of theorized it in my funding bid as an example of co-duction, taking that from Maureen McClay's wonderful essay, Romanticism or Now, which is available on my blog, which means leading through conversation and close reading. And as this is an AHRC leadership fellowship, I thought this was a really interesting way to think about leading from a particularly English literature background, that we're sort of talking together about our research, and that is sort of taking us to hopefully new approaches and new insights and new methodologies about romantic studies in particular. I'm really proud, as I said in December, but I will reiterate now, that these work as celebrations of the work of early career scholarship. So part of what I did in my funding bid was say that we will have funded opportunities, so it's a £100 bursary for people originally to come. It was designed to come to campus and see Edge Hill, but the pandemic has sort of forced us online, but I think also afforded us new ways of communicating with a much more international audience online, to get the work of early careers researchers out to a big audience, to think about their new and insightful and original approaches to romantic studies, and in this case, society. And as I've preempted myself there, the table talks are focused on new approaches to romantic studies. I talked a lot last time, probably too much, about my own progress. So I've tried to condense it to a slide this time, and to begin, well, to continue, I suppose, with some kind of apology to myself, because it's only really me who I'm accountable at the moment, to say that I should have already worked on a chapter about ridiculous nature, and I should be showing my work about ridiculous society at this table talk, which is focused on society. And instead of that, I've done bits and pieces of planning on all sorts of chapters, but I have written a contracted chapter on the wonderful novel by E.T.A. Hoffmann, which is illustrated here by the picture of the writing cat, called The Life and Opinions of Tomcat Murr, an autobiography of the titular feline. And I've spoken about Tomcat Murr taking his readers from the sublime to the ridiculous. So that's sort of part of it's going to be part of a collection called Romantic Beasts, which I'm very excited and very honoured to have been invited to be part of. Rita is one of our panelists here, and I invited her along to sort of see how Table Talks worked, and also to be another voice in the conversation. We hired her in May, on the 4th of May, may the 4th be with her, as my postdoctoral research fellow. She works, as she was saying in the chat, on Jane Austen, and we enjoyed the juxtaposition of circumstances of joining on May the 4th and working on Austen, to have this beautiful illustration of Jane Austen wielding a lightsaber by Kelly Light, I think is her Insta handle. And the thing that I've actually been working on for the past few weeks is a conference paper for next week at the Black Studies and Romanticism Conference, organised by Kate Singer, where I'm talking about Black humour in M. Nobesi Phillips' Zong and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, which I finished today, when I probably should have been working on this and definitely paying more attention to time zones than this. Which I'm very much looking forward to. That's a free online event that's taking place next Thursday and Friday, and I will, when I can, I will drop some information about that in the chat. And if you are free and interested, I think Kate would welcome you all. And it looks like a fantastic event with sort of much better scholars than me talking about very off its moment and pertinent and essential ideas about romanticism in relation to Black studies. So that's my progress, such as it is. Moving on to the lightning table talks. I think the lightning table, which I covet still, is available from Poland, from a company called Deco Echo, and I fear that that Brexit might mean that it is difficult to transport to Britain, but it's a beautiful thing, which I thought combined the idea of lightning table talks neatly and elegantly. So this is a bit of an idea of the schedule for the evening. I'll talk in a moment about from ridiculous objects to ridiculous subjects, lessons for little rustics in Charlotte Smith's Rural Walks. Felicity is my invited guest. I've known Felicity for some years, and she was the person that I wanted to invite for this, particularly in relation to her work on Charles Lamb, a friend of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who's one of the key figures for me, and is also going to speak about Charles and Mary Lamb collaborative creativity and poetry for children. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Felicity here and to continue a conversation that's been going on for a number of years about romantic period life writing in particular, but also children's literature and all sorts of other things. So I'm clapping and welcoming Felicity as my invited sort of keynote speaker who follows me. And then we move into our 5 early career researchers who I'm going to invite to sort of drop their biographies into the chat, either now or as they sort of come in their sort of order. So first we have Adam speaking about ridiculing the eco-antisocial in James Woodhouse's poetry. Then we're going to have Merrilies speaking about object lessons in Mary Wollstonecraft's feminist polemic. Then Adam, the second Adam of the evening, we're going to call them Adam B and Adam N, is going to give us a taster of his own sort of work in progress verse biography of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And then Anne Clare is going to speak about romantic sociability in Amelia Opie's verse. And we're going to finish off with Corinna on mottos and mayhem in Catherine Gore's Pin Money, which I know already from the chat that people are specifically excited for. So we're going to end on some kind of crescendo before we move into the conversational element of the evening. So I'm going to give my own lightning table talk to start off the evening belatedly, and then we're going to move into Felicity's and the early career researchers. So mine has been given the title by me, From Ridiculous Object to Ridiculing Subject, Lessons for Little Rustics in Charlotte Smith's Rural Walks. And I sort of I discovered Rural Walks as I was working on the honest to goodness second chapter of my thesis that I should have been talking about in December, but I've only been working on it since January, about ridiculous approaches to nature, or how romantic writers use ideas of the ridiculous to think about nature. But I found a quote that I thought, or a couple of quotes that I thought also spoke about this evening's theme about society. But I stumbled across it when I was actually analysing a joke book published anonymously in the early 19th century, 1806, I think, called The Miseries of Modern Life by the Reverend James Beresford, that has 2 grumpy old men, Mr. Timothy Testy and Mr. Samuel Sensitive, kind of competing with each other about who is the more miserable. And the first set of miseries in the book are miseries of the country, and one of them replies to the other, I'm going to leave off Ramble's father to Miss C. Smith. The countryside is so disgusting, essentially. And I found out that Ramble's father was the second volume of children's writing about sort of nature and the countryside, written by Charlotte Smith, a sequel to Rural Walks. And the thing that I'm going to talk about this evening is a couple of brief snippets from Rural Walks, in which, first of all, I argue that the main character, Caroline, who comes from London as this sort of spoilt, conceited, and kind of ridiculous little girl who despises the country and her sort of cousins and aunts' sort of backward, rustic ways. She reacts very sort of very negatively to being surrounded by the countryside. And in one of the early chapters of Rural Walks, called The Dormouse, she starts to ridicule one of their neighbours, which Mrs. Woodfield tells her off about because she's essentially punching down on someone less fortunate than themselves, like Emma Woodhouse and Miss Bates, effectively. And she's dragged on a walk that she doesn't want to go on, and then a farmer invites them to sort of look after a dormouse, which Caroline rejects as disgusting, and it goes to the younger sister. But I thought it was really interesting when Caroline, sighing and aside, says, I think I should like to be a dormouse if I were always to live in the country in winter. And I like this as a sort of an example of her kind of, it kind of embodied her alienation and ennui from moving from the city to the countryside. But I think it also sort of gave us sort of reason to hope in Charlotte Smith's world for Caroline, in that she was starting to think of herself as a dormouse. And I think there's something to be said about the sort of connections that can be made between children and animals in children's literature, and children looking after animals and children thinking of themselves as animals. And Caroline's identification with the sleeping dormouse kind of shows her ridiculousness, that but also shows her capacity for change. And my argument is that by volume 2's chapter, The Visit, she has changed in lots of ways. She's sort of become acclimatized to her aunt and cousin's ways, but it works sort of less straightforwardly than I was imagining, because all of Mrs. Woodfield, her daughter Elizabeth, and their cousin Caroline join together to mock the deliberately named Mrs. Hamerton. She hammers the ton. And Mrs. Woodfield talks about her being laughed at by aristocrats rather than laughed with, and hopes that maybe with this sort of higher class of people that she, this arrivist Hamerton is faced with, she might sort of not talk as much as she talks to them. And then her daughter says, "I cannot imagine how that is possible, for I observed that whenever anything for a moment interrupted their mamma, the young ladies all began talking at once." And then I loved Caroline's image, moving on from the dormouse identification. "They put me in mind of a nest of hungry young birds all opening their mouths at once." And I like the way that Caroline has sort of developed as a figure who can kind of turn her own ridiculousness into a ridicule that is acceptable to both Mrs. Woodfield and her daughter Elizabeth, who's become friends with Caroline, as something which kind of which punches up. So it's attacking someone who deserves, in Charlotte Smith's world, to be ridiculed. So I was really interested in how the toggling between ridiculousness and ridicule functioned in this example of children's literature. I was expecting, as what happens in the Dormouse episode, for Caroline to be told off for this kind of satirical, she gets told off for having this kind of French cutting edge to her satire by Mrs. Woodfield. But come volume 2, she sort of honed that satire to kind of matriarchally accepted targets in a way which kind of uses this natural image of the baby birds squawking for attention to the mother bird to mock the whole sort of ridiculous family setup of the Hamiltons. So that's my lightning talk is just looking at two natural images from Charlotte Smith's rural walks and how they are used to reflect on kind of self-satire or self-ridiculousness, and then to be turned outward to ridicule social others. And I'm going to, yes, if I click on this next slide, it says, "Remind me to show you the next slide at the end of the evening." So somebody take me in hand, as I've already made various mistakes this evening, and remind me that I want to go back to the next slide that I have on here. But I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to invite Felicity as my sort of keynote interlocutor to start up her material.
Right, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself, but I'm now, can everybody see my slide? Great. Thank you so much, Andy, for asking me to join in, and I'm really pleased to be a part of this event. And I want to start off with an image of collaborative creativity, a shared table where brother and sister sit writing like Hermia and Helena in the Midsummer Night's Dream, or rather like an old literary Darby and Joan, I taking snuff and he groaning all the while and saying he can make nothing of it. And which he always says until he's finished. Then he finds out he has made something of it. So this domestic portrait is by Mary Lamb, and she's talking about the production of the Tales of Shakespeare with her brother Charles. And I love this image of the ways in which sibling love and support and creative collaboration might find a way through disaster. Because 10 years previously, as I'm sure we're all well aware of, Mary Lamb had killed her mother in a manic crisis. And since then, the Lambs have battled to overcome their shared difficulties with mental health and to build a life together, a remarkably successful one, as their body of children's work pays testament to. This body of writing is, well, on the one hand, it's task work, as Charles describes it. It's written for their friend William Godwin, probably purely to make money for the Lambs, for their enterprise, the Juvenile Library. But I think it has a much deeper meaning. Mary's writing for children, I think, is encouraged by Charles as a way of structuring her routine and helping her deal with her periodic mental crises, which defined both siblings' lives. And as we're beginning to realise, it's also important work in its own right, sly, intriguing, often ambiguous. And I'm working now on an edition of the Lambs writing for children for the OUP collected works, which is being edited by Greg Dart and which is going to come out over the next few years. The standard edition of the Lambs works was published in 1912, and the children's writing has never really had proper scholarly editing. And it ranges from Charles's knockabout, slyly subversive nursery rhymes. Here's the King and Queen of Hearts. His first work for children in 1805. And I can't resist giving you another lovely coloured image from the British Library edition. He writes another book of nursery rhyme, Prince Doris, both little copperplate books. And then we've got the better known works like Tales from Shakespeare or Charles's Adventures from Ulysses, read by the schoolboy James Joyce. And then we've got lesser known works like their collaborative book of short stories, Mrs. Lester's School, and the book I'm going to touch on today, Poetry for Children, 1809. Both of those works are very engaging. They delicately allude to issues of isolation, anxiety, grief, and they show a real acuity, I think, to the needs of children. I mentioned that all the work was published by the Godwins, and there was, I think, quite an ideological edge to the Godwins' courting of the Lambs as writers. We're increasingly recognising the serious purpose of the Juvenile Library, as critics like Pamela Clement and more recently John Eric Hansen have pointed out. It may be seen in many ways as a continuation of that 1790s radical project. Godwin's approach to the child reader bears all the hallmarks of his dissenting education at the Hoxton Academy, which encouraged his pedagogical theory, in the words of his autobiography, designed to encourage the child's exercise of free judgment. And you can see him talking about it here in his Inquirer essay, where he's talking about choice of reading for children. And he's saying, trust the child in a certain degree with himself. Suffer him to wander in the wilds of literature. Well, that radical edge certainly doesn't go unnoticed by government informers, as Pamela Clement's written about. They saw this instruction of children as a kind of backdoor for infidels and Republicans to give their opinions. So that publishing context, Godwinian, politically inflected, is the one I want to bear in mind as we come into having a look at these very sweet poems for children. And it's quite a long way from their Victorian and Edwardian afterlives. So there's 3 poems that I've chosen for us to look at. I'm not going to talk about them all in detail, but they are on the homework sheet if people would like to go away and look at them. They're characteristically simple verse, but as recent scholarship like Donnell Roos has pointed out, we need to start taking this children's work of the Romantic period seriously. And in that spirit, very much inspired by her work, I've given us 3 poems. The first one, Feigned Courage, probably by Mary Lamb, shows the child play acting battle. Horatio, of ideal courage vain, was flourishing in air his father's cane. Well, the inevitable injury happens and he goes weeping off to bed. This military game is a reminder that Poetry for Children is published just 4 years after the Battle of Trafalgar, and the legacies of war, deaths at sea, really haunt the children's work. And it's hard not to see a direct allusion to Horatio Nelson, because children of this generation would have been acutely aware of his hero status, of the pomp of his state funeral just a few years before. But the poem seems to cast a sceptical eye on military prowess in general through that ridiculous portrayal of heroism. And it also questions gender roles by portraying, not ungently, the weeping little boy, the whimpering male child, not underlining a moral, but asking child readers to draw a parallel between imagined acts of cruelty and slaughter and the real effect of pain. Next, I've chosen the Mimic Harlequin. Again, it's probably one of Mary Lamb's. Also notable, I think, for its unjudgmental approach to childish mischief. And again, this is what I love about the Lamb's work. It shows child deep in pretend, in make-believe. I'll make believe and fancy something strange. But all this acting simply results in upending the room, annoying the cat and his mother. Yet, although we hear the mother's reproof at the end, we don't actually get any moral. The overall effect is one of comedy. At the pathetic ending of the young Harlequin's escapade, there's no heavy-handed narratorial intervention about the ruined needlework. Here, as elsewhere in the poetry, it's the comic, but also the transformative potential of the child's imagination, which is emphasised. And finally, just coming to the end now, I've picked Queen Oriana's Dream to give us a sense of Charles's writing. We know this one was his because he reprints it in his works of 1818, and it also overlaps with his interest in Elizabethan Jacobean poets. His Specimens of Dramatic Poets was published in 1808. It's replete with Shakespearean allusion, but its main target is the inability of the writer, Richard, to live up to the imaginative goal he set himself. What he read with such delight of, thought he could as easily write of, but his over-young invention kept not pace with brave intention. There's an echo here of that portrait of Charles himself we began with, struggling and groaning to make something of his writing. And it works alongside the playful bathos of Mary Lamb's poems, I think, where pretend or make-believe comes up against the limits of the everyday. And yet there's still a real joy in imaginative fantasy here. There's a richness to all that elaborate language that we start off with. It sort of revels in its own magnific strain, I think, and there is, again, a refusal to curtail it with a strict moral. So that's a recurrent strain throughout the poems, and indeed the writing of the Lambs more broadly. This idea of the ridiculous, the play, the wildness that's held just within limits. All the poems use humour to question and to puncture pretension, I think, whether that's gender roles and military games in Feigned Courage or authorial greatness in Queen Oriana's Dream. And because I think it fits so nicely with the theme of the ridiculous, let's just end with another moment where the child's rhyme is used to critique polite society. So here's Lamb's drunken mockery of Wordsworth's stamp controller senior at Benjamin Haydon's immortal dinner party, where he gets so offensive he has to be shut in a cupboard. This reminds us of the often rebellious, satirical, shrewd edge to the Lamb's humour, I think, running right through their work. There's an abiding interest in the power of the ridiculous, in the ways in which imaginative play, irony, humour, make-believe might challenge or disrupt authority. Okay, thanks, Andy. I'm going to pass over now to Adam, our next speaker.
Thanks, Felicity. I'm just going to share my screen.
Just thank you, Felicity. While Adam is sharing the screen, that was a wonderful lightning talk, and just lovely to hear that children's poetry. Fantastic. Thank you very
much. Just checking, can everyone see that full screen? Is that okay? Great, thank you. Just see if I can cycle. Great. There are many reasons why you might not have heard about James Woodhouse's 28,000-line verse autobiography. While it was begun in the 1790s, shortly before Wordsworth's Prelude, and bears many striking parallels, it remains overshadowed by this more canonical work. Right now, I want to make a case for why Woodhouse's Crispinus Scripturaris deserves attention, and why it's crucial for giving an alternative view of Romantic period conceptions of nature. By the 1790s, Woodhouse had experienced a range of landscape gardens. A shoemaker by trade, he'd emerged to notice in the 1760s through the help of patrons in his local Shropshire, including William Shenstone of the Leasows and Lord Littleton of Hagley Hall. While Woodhouse was invited into these places to enjoy and write about their beauty, the exclusionary nature of the landscape garden was never far away. Indeed, as I have discussed elsewhere, after Shenstone's death, Woodhouse was beaten up by the Leasows' new owner, an industrialist from nearby Birmingham, who mistook Woodhouse as a trespasser and set his servants upon him. Woodhouse was also patronised by Elizabeth Montagu, the founder of the Bluestocking Salon and wife of the wealthy English landowner and MP Edward Montagu. In 1767, she offered Woodhouse the job of land steward at her estate of Sandalford in Berkshire. While initially rapturous, their relationship soured, one of the main reasons being their different attitudes towards the land they shared. Woodhouse was fired by Montagu in 1778 and subsequently rehired in 1781, just in time to oversee Sandalford's extensive landscaping by Capability Brown. Woodhouse was again dismissed in 1788 and immediately resumed writing and publishing, including the first chapter of his autobiography in 1814. Now, I'm aware I have not got to the text yet, some extracts of which you might have read in the homework Andy sent out. I don't have lots of time to go into the details, but my point is to make a case for why Woodhouse's working experiences led to a more critical understanding of land use and abuse in this period, which is socially and ecologically conscious, reflecting, as I see it, an embryonic example of eco-social thinking. By the 1790s, Woodhouse had certainly changed his ideas about landscape. The ostensible equanimity of his earlier poetry was replaced in Crispinus Scripturaris with a more critical view of landscape improvement and the violent processes which underlay it. Take his opening description of his native Shropshire, in which he considers the way in which the fashion for landscape improvement in fact had damaging real-world effects, causing the very inverse of improvement for those who lived on the land. Speaking of the enclosure of nearby Himley to create wild forest for hunting, he describes, instead of rustic sonnets, raving yells, nature reduced to savage state again, excluding culture and expunging men. Will reason sanction such a base abuse, which tends to mischief more than social use? Will wisdom warrant such preposterous plan, thus murdering arts, uncivilizing man? Can mild humanity such scheme caress, that banishes even brutes' poor happiness? The raving yells here refer to the cries of huntsmen charging through the forest and suggest how the social injustice of landscape exclusion was mirrored in violence towards animals. Importantly, this socially critical current in Woodhouse's verse results in a more than conventionally green expression of love for nature. As Bridget Keegan has noted, Woodhouse espoused a Georgic view of land, which led him to prefer the productive over the purely ornamental. However, this Georgic conception was challenged by his time in Montagu's employment, where, as I argue, Woodhouse began to see the ways in which both landscaping and agricultural improvement were potentially destructive. Woodhouse had many reasons to be personally aggrieved by his treatment by his employer. Montagu expected ever greater rewards, stating in 1774, "I exhort Mr. Woodhouse to make Sandalford every year carry out and bring in more money." However, his experience allowed him to see the negative environmental effects of excessive profit-driven improvement. As you may have seen from the second set of extracts I provided, Woodhouse describes at length his own transformation into a farmer at Sandalford and the ultimate failure of the crop experiments Montagu insisted upon. This led him to conceive of nature's limits and the need for more careful land management. Above all, though, it was Woodhouse's account of the re-landscaping of Sandalford which inspires his reflection upon the wider dangers of the ethos of improvement. Importantly, by this point, Montague was successfully operating a large coal mining business in Northumberland, which she had inherited from her late husband. As Stephen Bending argues, the purpose of her pastoral retreat at Sandalford was to function as a necessary foil to the self-display of a fine lady in the metropolis, thus naturalizing her wealth and distinguishing her use of it from the false aspirations of the vulgar rich. Woodhouse, however, sees through these idealizations, clearly pointing to the extractive industries that were the basis of Montague's wealth. He wrote that she racks every tenant, ransacks all her mines to build her temple and adorn her shrines. In alerting the reader to these far-off mines, Woodhouse begins to present a much larger scale view, national in scope, if not even global, which connected improvement with the aggressive extraction of wealth in locations elsewhere. In what is a particularly powerful culmination of this vision, which we're focusing on today, Woodhouse imagines Cunning's distillation of wealth from reeking valleys and from weeping plains, from reservoirs in mines which skill can draw, with forcing pumps and engines framed by law, or what state chemistry extracts in drops from furnaces and forges, sheds and shops, from sweat of toiling man or labouring beast, the mighty mass grows, constantly increased, from every melting eye and moistened hand, till every source seems dry through all the land. But scarce a single particle returns to feed those fountains, or to fill those urns, to make more fresh and fair each rude retreat, each plain more pleasant, each recess more sweet, all only pouring from its plenteous stores, a showery deluge on dependent shores, replenishing each pouch before too rich, and mounting pride to more mischievous pitch. Portraying the degrading effects of extractive, profit-driven industries on both labour and people and the land itself, this concluding vision is quintessentially eco-social. While Woodhouse's solutions for a nobler scheme of living on the land are also dotted throughout the poem, it is this scene in which he decisively connects social and environmental domination and prophesies the potential world-transforming effects which the emergence of capitalist political economy in Britain might have. That's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam. That was wonderful, and really exciting to hear more about Woodhouse. So next on our schedule is Merylise. While Merylise starts her PowerPoint, I'll just say thank you that we've already got exciting questions coming in on the Q&A. So I've had a sort of glimpse of it, so I can prepare an answer for you, Danelle. But please keep those questions coming as we go through these lightning talks, and then we'll have the sort of conversation flowing in the second half of the evening. Here we go. So over to you, Merylise, and I think you've already given your biography maybe a little bit up the chat. Yeah, you look like you're ready to go. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Everyone hear me okay? Yep, cool. Okay, so the passage I've chosen attempts to grasp the psychological and intellectual benefits of consciously shaping objects of desire in the imagination. I want to briefly explore how this passage creates object lessons in a very particular and unique way, a way that models and performs the struggles of constructing a rational mind and a rational society through our choice of objects, our object of attention, desire, and social emulation. For Wollstonecraft, object lessons are the way in which we learn virtues through struggling with the way society and our own nature sometimes directs us to inappropriate objects, or how we too often have inappropriate responses to our chosen objects. This is an epistemological undertaking, I suggest, but I also want to suggest that this text and this passage demonstrate interesting ways in which the epistemological and the social slip into the metaphysical. Passion and reason drive each other into transcendental meditations on Christian spirituality, seeking to demonstrate that we can prove the existence of a deity in being called to pursue ideal objects in the right way. What I'm interested in is the models of mind and society that lie behind Wollstonecraft's central ideas in the whole text, that it is only prejudice that would assign a sex to virtue, and that there are no sexual virtues. This is the first sentence of my excerpt. I see the sons and daughters of men pursuing shadows and anxiously wasting their powers to feed passions which have no adequate object. It's the very excess of these blind impulses, pampered by that lying yet constantly trusted guide, the imagination, did not, by preparing them for some other state, render short-sighted mortals wiser without their own concurrence, or what comes to the same thing when they were pursuing some imaginary present good. So, directing blind passions into objects, even inadequate ones, can prepare us for a future state. The anxiety caused by poor object choices at some level, and even without the assent of the person experiencing it, preparing the imagination for spiritual progress. There is also seemingly no issue with objects being imaginary, because the imagination is still being prepared for higher things through a wrestling with the passions inspired by mental objects. But later in the excerpt, Wollstonecraft says she must descend from her height, presumably moral and metaphysical height, down into society and what she calls the common stream of ambition, love, hope, and fear. And ultimately, it is forbearance of the struggles with object choice, both our own and that of society, which generates virtue. I have chosen the passage that I have because of its intense interest in object lessons, but also because of what I think is its interesting resistance to paraphrase. And this, I think, shows the pressure of Wollstonecraft grappling with ideas she wants to refute with a rational argument, whilst at some level registering their emotional power. Specifically, these ideas are that of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, against whom the whole text is polemically directed in some sense. And Wollstonecraft quotes huge passages of Rousseau's Emile or Emilius of 1762 in order to critique his reasoning. Wollstonecraft takes issue with the idea that behavior, will, and desire should be pressed into a self-reinforcing loop which stabilizes social and gender norms. And Rousseau's object lessons have been described very well, I think, by Elizabeth Wingrove in her book Rousseau's Republican Romance. And this is what she says very pithily. Desire intensifies the ambiguous interplay of force and will. A show of force is necessary to the expression of will, and consent is always consent to the terms of one's domination. So for Wingrove, desire in this model provides the benefit of coercion when will and consent become mutually reinforcing. Wollstonecraft is at pains to counter this idea with the idea that mental training in object lessons creates virtuous rather than vicious circles between behavior and desire. I've created a diagram, which is just for my own thinking that I'm going to share with you. It shows my interpretation of Rousseau's and Wollstonecraft's models of mind in society. The parts in red are where I think the object lessons are happening in their respective systems. So I'm suggesting here that Wollstonecraft is taking the same fundamental ideas as Rousseau and reconfiguring them to suit her version of a feminist program. I'm aiming to think through here how for Rousseau, will and desire become an aspect of habit, which should directly contribute to producing a virtuous and rational society. But Wollstonecraft flips Rousseau's model to some degree, arguing that reason should be the central driver of behavior in order to produce responsible kinds of willing and desiring that would be difficult to distinguish from virtue itself. But this leaves virtue and desire somewhat at odds, whereas Rousseau attempted to connect them through cultivating certain habits of feeling. So Wollstonecraft also addresses the idea of habit in this passage here. The habit of reflection and the knowledge attained by fostering my passions might be shown to be equally useful, though the object would prove equally fallacious. They would all appear in the same light, if they were not magnified by the governing passion implanted in us by the author of all good, to call forth and strengthen the faculties of each individual and enable it to attain all the experience that an infant can obtain, who does certain things it cannot tell why. The problem being explored here is not as simple as that we tend to adorn imaginary objects with spiritual valency and then worship them, as this would be ridiculous, really. object choice, though often inadequate, is ultimately indifferent. It is the way in which the rational imagination enlivens its objects and the way in which we use our relationships with idealized objects that would lead to virtue. In the passage I just read out, there's a grammatical knottiness, I think, where it seems as though the it, which can attain the experience an infant can attain, relates to the faculties of each individual rather than to the habit of reflection introduced at the beginning of the sentence. And the faculties of each individual becoming a singular entity, and it puts us in mind both of something which partakes of the nature of the Christian God and something resembling what would later be referred to as the unconscious, something working beneath the radar of conscious experience. This instability in the grammatical subject and object of this sentence, I think, shows the strain of Wollstonecraft Hughes' synthesis of metaphysics with something we might like to call social epistemology. And to conclude, the objects modelled here are multifaceted, at once epistemological, social, sexual, and ontological. I suggest that we need to attend to such knotty moments in romantic text where objects inhabit these multiple dimensions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Marylise. You sent an email asking about the chart, and I absolutely love the chart. And maybe we might have to go back to it later in the evening and think more on it. I thought that was a fascinating talk on Wollstonecraft. So next up we have our second Adam of the evening, and that is Adam Nyquirk giving us a verse biography, or a bit of a verse biography of Coleridge. So Adam, when you're ready, I'm handing over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Hello. Well, I guess my presentation is a little bit different because I wrote the texts that I will be sort of criticizing, which is a little bit strange. But also I've tried to make that strangeness part of the sort of aura of my work, I suppose. So a lot of what I've been doing as I've been working on this biography, besides thinking about Coleridge and thinking about his life, thinking about the very strange question of how do you present his life, which I'll try to get into in a minute. Is asking myself, is it, I mean, it's correct, but what does it mean for us to sort of create a distinction between creative work that these days tends to be rather personal and confessional, and we sort of expect it to be that way. And then on the other hand, we have a lot of scholarly work that is expected to be sort of impersonal. And even as we look at romantic texts, which are maybe full of emotion, full of the romantic longing, right? The Sehnsucht, right? We sort of keep them at arm's length as we look at them rather analytically. I see the romantic ridiculous maybe as a project that is trying to perhaps blur some of these practices, and they're pretty widespread cultural practices that if we do think about other places where they intersect, it could end up with sort of a ridiculous performance on either side of that line. For me, I felt like now that I started my dissertation in 2019, I've written a lot of it, but it's not done. I've been able to have this opportunity, instead of going to conferences and reading critical works, I've been able to go and read from my poetry and then sort of act like it's critical, and I've written a critical commentary as well. So there is a critical aspect, but it's curious to me that I get to feel like I'm performing the poetry to people, and yet at the same time I'm sort of doing something scholarly too, which has been fun. So I suppose I should talk about what I picked, but I picked an excerpt from the second part of the poem. The poem currently has 5 parts, which covers all of Coleridge's biological life and then kind of goes into some areas thinking about his legacy or his afterlife. And I chose a poem called Gated, Spring 1794. It's supposed to have occurred, sort of occurring in the spring of 1794. And most of the poems in the work are dated like this. They give you a year, So that just as in a biography, the biographer is sort of always bringing up the year or the date so that you have a sense of, okay, time is moving forward. As you go through the biography, you kind of move forward in a sense of, okay, this happened now. And one of the reasons that I chose this poem is because I think it deals with a less studied period in Coleridge's life. Right before he meets Robert Southey and starts to think about panisocracy and immigrating to America, which doesn't happen, right? And then a little bit after that, he moves to the West Country and meets William Wordsworth. And then most people kind of know, oh yeah, then he starts to write his most famous poetry and kind of goes from there. There's this period in his life before he meets Southey and he hasn't really like sort of latched on to anything yet. And you can sort of see his life as a series of latchings-ons to people or to big ideas in a way, and also at the same time kind of developing his own ideas. But to kind of make a long story short, if you think about his childhood up to this point and sort of thinking about, I guess a book that comes to mind is Beverly Field's Reality's Dark Dream, which is a study of Coleridge that came out in the 60s that is not really known. But sort of talking about how Coleridge was a depressive personality, it was kind of psychoanalyzing him. So to kind of condense all this, I'm sort of riffing on this idea that he's a depressed sort of sad young man. He's a little bit emo, and he's stuck in this university, but he's also sort of scheming about what he's going to do when he gets out, and he's writing this letter sort of to his brother George, who he thought of as a father. And this poem kind of carries you forward in a sense, thinking about like, well, what was Coleridge thinking about at this time? What was he sort of performing at this time, and what's he kind of hiding sort of between the lines, sometimes literally, right, as we write lines about him. And at the same time, I suppose that this is also just a performance of poetry, so that the auditor is invited to sort of feel confused about whether they should be thinking critically about this subject of the biography, or should they be listening to the poetry as kind of like, you know, a lyric expression or something like that. So, okay, thank you.
Have you finished, Adam? I'm gonna
Yes.
clap. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, fab. And so interesting to hear about your work. So the next person to speak is Anne Claire, who I'm going to hand over, and I think you do have a PowerPoint for us to look at.
I do, just a very short one.
Thank you for dropping your biography in the chat. So you've introduced yourself.
Yeah. Sorry, can you see?
Yeah, it's
okay.
there.
Just start from the beginning.
Fantastic.
So in 1799, the European magazine published lines addressed by Mrs. O.P. to her husband on his painting the picture of her friend Mrs. Twiss at her request. It is both a tribute to the painter's skill, a public expression of marital affection, and a meditation on female friendship as a source of poetic inspiration, a subject that animated O.P.'s verse throughout her career. This was the first public print appearance of Amelia Alderson as Mrs. O.P., a year after her marriage to the painter John O.P. The portrait was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1799 with a double portrait of Amelia, as you can see on this slide, which, as Roxanne Eberle suggests, dramatically announces Amelia's entrance into London's professional arts circles. Unfortunately, I don't have an image of the portrait of Mrs. Twiss to share with you. O.P.'s address to her husband was later included in the first issue of Robert Southey's The Annual Anthology under a shorter title, signed with the name Amelia O.P. in full, marking the poem as the beginning of her literary identity as Amelia O.P. The text is itself, as its title indicates, a gift poem thanking her husband for the portrait of her friend Frances Kemble Twiss. Twiss was the sister of the illustrious tragedian Sarah Siddons, with whom O.P. was also friends. And Twiss's husband was the theatre critic Francis Twiss, with whom Amelia and John O.P. were friends. as well. So the portrait, therefore evokes the couple's joint networks of sociability, which included the leading radical thinkers of the 1790s, including William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, Thomas Holcroft, and Elizabeth Inchbald. So the social circle is at the heart of the interconnections between the portrait and the poem, as both works register the effective ties between members of a group. They thus highlight the importance of sociability and artistic, literary, and political networks to artistic creation in the Romantic period. The poem's inclusion in Southey's annual anthology further reflects Opie's connections to radical literary circles. Southey's anthology was lambasted by the Anti-Jacobin Review and the British Critic, as was probably to be expected, for its Jacobinism and high-flown notions of liberty. But Opie's poem was one of only 2 texts reproduced in full in both periodicals. And the Anti-Jacobin Review selected both this poem and another song by Amelia as the best compositions in the volume, as, and here I quote, the flowers of this anthology that were wasting their fragrance among weeds have now been rescued on the pages of the Anti-Jacobin Review. So Opie's poetry remains untainted by its otherwise clear association with radical writers. And there is a further affiliation with dissenting circles with the insertion of a line, as you can see on line 5, from Anna Letitia Barbauld's Characters, a poem that also celebrates female friendship. And so in Barbauld's poem too, the female friend serves as a muse for the woman poet. Female friendship is one of 2 dominant themes in the poem, the portrait memorializing these affective ties, the friend having left for the distant scenes of Bath to accompany her husband. Still shall I here behold the friend I love, still see that smile, endearing, artless, kind. So the anaphora underlines the role of representation in memory. The poem also addresses the impact that marriage can have on women's relationships, and the difficulty of balancing and reconciling female friendship with the ties of marriage. In Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, for instance, Elizabeth Bennet resigns herself to the inevitable distance that her friend Charlotte Lucas's marriage to Mr. Collins will inevitably introduce. Their correspondence was as regular and frequent as it had ever been, Austen writes. That it should be equally unreserved was impossible. Elizabeth could never address her, that is Charlotte Lucas, without feeling that all the comfort of intimacy was over. Part of this gradual erosion of the woman's friendship is surely linked to Elizabeth's feelings about the match, but the passage nonetheless points to a distance between female friends after marriage, a concern shared by Opie. The speaker notes that in her breast contending feelings rise, feelings on which the poem concludes. This pride and friendship, pride and friendship war with equal strife, and now the friend exults, and now the wife. As you can see, friend and wife are capitalized, visually underlining the opposition. Yet the poem also encodes John Opie's recognition of the significance of this friendship to his young wife, as the portrait a honeymoon gift. Sorry, I just lost my line. The portrait commemorates the bond between Amelia and Frances Campbell Twiss. Opie notes that her husband's pencil has traced those features painted on my heart, suggesting that John has not simply produced a striking likeness, but has captured Amelia's perception of her friend. The implied gaze of the painting is not that of the male artist, but that of the female friend. The second dominant issue is the tribute to the artist. My heart proclaims I'm of the giver proud, the speaker says. The poem functions as a means of publicising and promoting John's art, which in turn has inspired Opie to pen these lines. Both artists' work mutually reinforcing each other. This interdependency encourages us to think about the collaborative nature of artistic creation in the Romantic period. In taking this portrait as the source of her inspiration, Opie also elevates the genre of portraiture, which was often dismissed as a lower genre next to the grand style of history painting. John has successfully captured the character of her friend, the greatest skill an artist could display. The poem's subject matter foregrounds the importance of the gallery as a space of sociability. As Christopher Rovey has argued, exhibition culture participated in an increased social inclusivity, reimagining the national social body. Rovey identifies the encounter with portraiture as central to the imagining of a British social body, and OP's lines encode the role that portraiture and exhibition had in this reimagining. In her 1834 collection, Lays of the Dead, OP returned to this portrait in the series on the portraits of deceased relatives and friends which hang around me, and she adds a note that explains that one of my first published lays was on this picture. This highlights the poem's and the portrait's significance to both OP's personal life and literary career, pointing to the interconnection between personal ties and public recognition. The poem thus demonstrates the importance of considering networks of sociability in the Romantic period and communal and collaborative rather than solitary creativity, as scholars have recently recognised, and as has already been touched upon tonight. And the poem also stresses the importance of the visual arts in the Romantic period, inviting us to continue exploring the complex relationships between the sister arts. In just 16 lines, To Mr. OP offers an illuminating insight into the fascinating world of Romantic society and creativity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and Claire, and a really nice focus on that poem that sort of opened up a huge sort of area for us to think about later. So finally, we come to our last speaker, Corinna, and I think we have sort of excited members of the audience who've been waiting to hear about Silver Fork fiction. So I'm going to sort of pass over to you now, and give you time to load up a PowerPoint.
Yeah, I'm just loading a PowerPoint. My internet has locked twice briefly tonight already. I'm sorry I wasn't visually there for everyone else's talks, but I have been here the whole time, I promise. But if there are any problems, I don't know, wave your arms about or something.
We can see that now, so it looks like, and I think if we all switch our screens off, we should give you some bandwidth to be able to speak. Connect.
I am in the best room in the house for internet, so fingers crossed. Okay, I'm going to be talking tonight about mottos and mayhem in Catherine Gore's Pin Money. So Catherine Gore is one of those novelists whose work is often overlooked because of identification with what is now called the Silver Fork genre of romantic fiction. There are many reasons why both this dismissal of her work and this labelling of it are unfair, and we'll hopefully have a chance to discuss some of these later on. For now, I wanted to look at the opening to her 1831 novel, Pin Money, a romance novel that gleefully throws convention to the winds in its first chapter by beginning with a betrothal. This is not a story about courtship, and Frederica Rawdon and her hero, Sir Brooke Rawley, are married by the second chapter. Instead, the narrative focuses on the difficulties that the couple encounter after marriage, specifically the misunderstandings and financial embarrassments that result from the allocation of pin money in the marriage settlement. That is, the payment of a small separate allowance to a wife for personal purchases such as clothes, accessories, and charitable donations. In 1712, Joseph Addison suggested that the doctrine of pin money is of a very late date, unknown to our great-grandmothers, but the expression was actually already in use by the late 1500s and was certainly in Thomas Otway's mind when he wrote his very successful play Venice Preserved, from which Gore derives her title page motto. On first glance, this line is simply a literal description of the novel's title. Here's something to buy pins. But the original context of the line tells a very different story. First performed in 1682, Otway's play revolves around a failed political coup against the Venetian state and the personal tragedy of an impoverished nobleman, Jaffir, whose attempt to extricate himself from the conspiracy results in him betraying his own best friend, Pierre. Like a lot of Restoration tragedies, it's a tale of exaggerated emotions that centers upon ideas about love, honor, and violence, including sexual violence, and most of the characters are dead by the end of it. The quotation that Gore uses comes at an early stage in the play when Pierre gives Jaffir money at a secret meeting for the purpose of hiring assassins. Pierre accesses the domestic image of matrimonial pin money as he hands corruption money to his friend, transforming the metonymy of pins into a euphemistic reference to another kind of sharp, pointy object, namely the 1,000 daggers, all in honest hands, that Pierre hopes will depose the Senate. The next question is, of course, would Gore's readers have been aware of this? Well, a recent editor noted that the play held a place on the London stage next to Shakespeare. Garrick and Sarah Siddons had starred in productions of it, and it had been performed to a packed house on Boxing Day only a year or two before Pin Money actually appeared. This means, of course, that the only information the reader has with which to assess Gore's novel is an apparently straight-faced invocation of Otway's melodramatic tragedy. The expectant reader turns the page, and all thoughts of Gothic terror are effectively routed by the appearance of the familiar narrative of Miss Austen, which Gore promises to simply shift to a higher sphere of society. And if you've had a chance to read the rest of the extract I sent around to accompany this talk, you'll see exactly what she means. Far from the melodrama of the motto, the text itself fully embraces Austen's idea of working on a little bit of ivory, relating the whole conversation of two sisters as they discuss the recent betrothal of one of their daughters. The mother of the newly betrothed, Lady Launceston, is in a haze of happiness, rather like a contented reader when they come to the matrimonial conclusion of an Austen novel, while her sister, Lady Tadcaster, persistently punctures this romantic bubble with talk of marriage settlements and pin money. The epigraph prefacing this chapter further focuses the reader's attention upon Lady Tadcaster's mercenary obsession. The line is taken from Oliver Goldsmith's Letters from a Citizen of the World, and the attitude to marriage that this conveys could hardly be a harsher antithesis to the emotional excess of Otway's Restoration drama. The gentleman's mortgaged lawn becomes enamoured of the lady's marriageable grove. The match is struck up, and both parties are piously in love. And Tadcaster's fixation upon financial compatibility here becomes another kind of extreme, opposite to melodramatic romance, but just as ridiculous. The severity of the shift between generic modes is rich and bathos, and Gore obviously wants us to laugh, but there is a serious side too. The narrative of Pin Money is all about comical misunderstandings that border upon farce, but that also have a striking amount of realism involved. Most of the matrimonial storms Frederica and Seabrook encounter occur because the couple has failed to communicate adequately with each other. It's funny, but it's also cautionary, almost to the point of becoming didactic. Gore's claimed inspiration, Austen, deflates the melodrama of the Gothic in her novel Northanger Abbey, only to focus upon the real drama every day. Catherine Morland might be mistaken in believing her future father-in-law to be a wife-murdering villain, but he does prove himself to be a selfish, mercenary domestic tyrant who puts Catherine at considerable risk when he sends her home unescorted. On the surface, it's farcical for Gore to reference Venice Preserved on her title page. Her novel is not a tragedy. Nobody dies at the end, and there is not even the faintest hint of a political coup. But Gore does transpose the same issues of love, honour, miscommunication, and anxiety about money onto an everyday setting, allowing us as readers to take seriously the very realistic everyday problems that she portrays. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I think that was a lovely climax to this evening's table talks. So what I'm going to do is suggest now that we have a 5-ish minute comfort break, even though we're sort of running very between times. And if everyone is still able to sort of hold on for the extra half an hour, given that we started half an hour late, we've still got plenty of time to have a conversation. So I would say if we can all come, like, go away, stretch our legs, go to the loo, have some kind of emotional and spiritual meltdown. That's just me. And then come back at 1:45, and then we'll be able to have a chat and a conversation. Donnell has already got in with a first great question for me and Felicity, which I spotted over the course of the evening. Please use the Q&A button to ask us more questions. This is your chance. If you don't need to go for the loo, this is your chance to get some questions in advance, and we'll come back at 1:45 in in order to have a chat and and answer your questions and have a bit of a conversation at the end. And thank you for the sort of stream of thanks that are coming in, which is really lovely to see. But let's reconvene in 5 minutes, or like 6 minutes, I think, and then we'll be back and ready and refreshed to answer your points. Say hello to Felicity. Hi, Felicity. Well, we're all coming back on now. we're a little bit early, so we'll start at 1:45. But thank you all for sticking with us. Those of you who've stuck with us, and thank you all for your papers and things. And thank you all for your thank yous and congratulations. It's been really nice. I'm breathing a sigh of relief now that we're partway through, and we had an audience, and I emailed everyone who emailed me and tried to give everyone the link. Phew. I should have paused the recording, but I haven't. So we've got everyone gets to experience the toilet break in real time, unless they can fast forward the later YouTube video. Right, I make it 1:45 now, and I'm just going to say more officially, thank you to Felicity, who was my keynote lightning talk giver, but also to the 5 early career researchers. And I should also say thank you to Rita, my postdoctoral research fellow, who has helped to keep me on the straight and narrow and been our sort of tweeter extraordinaire. So there's a great record of this experience on Twitter. Should you look up the hashtag table talks, and other people have been joining in, but Rita's given a really great record. But a sort of round of applause from me to all of you. They were really sort of wonderful and exciting papers. And I have some questions, but this time I'm not going to abuse my sort of strange chairing organizing privileges. I think I'll go into the Q&As that have been asked. So I saw one that Danelle asked, and if you don't mind, I'll read out the question for everyone. If you'd like to come in and ask a question that you're struggling to articulate in writing and would like to speak out, you can just write Q in the questions, I suppose, and I will upgrade you. But if you're happy to just write the question, I will read it out for people. So Danelle said, after mine and Felicity's talks, wonderful talks on Smith and the Lambs, and I noticed she'd said wonderful talks to everybody in the chat. I'm so intrigued by the snippets of humorous moments that Andrew and Felicity shared. Andrew suggested that Smith seemed to disapprove of French humour, and Felicity noted the Lamb's affectionate use of humorous play and ridiculousness to puncture pretensions. I'd love to hear more from both of you about the differences in forms of humour. French humour, lovely descriptive term that maybe needs to be expanded further. I take that on board. It seems to be synonymous with aristocratic, arch, superior, condescending humour, perhaps indicating a sort of pro-British middle class value versus continental values. And the Lamb's use of play/humour is just fascinating in that poetry. But I don't see the same use of playful humour in Mrs. Lester's school, and I wonder why not. Sorry for the long question, no worries. I'm thinking through ideas here, which is part of the point of this is to think through ideas. So I am gonna abuse my chairing privileges now and answer the first question. And I was looking again at the bit from Rural Walks that I was referring to, and I'll just read it out here. I've got it in front of me. Mrs. Woodfield sort of tells Caroline and Elizabeth off for making fun of one of their neighbours for her pretentiousness. And she says, to sort of after telling her off, Mrs. Woodfield says, you shouldn't feel mortified, or not at all, my dear Caroline. I am sorry to see that which, the French call l'esprit mordant caustique, which Smith footnotes and says biting, acrimonious, predominate so much both in you and in Elizabeth. That's specifically where I got the idea of French humour from, that she, Mrs. Woodfield, to characterize the kind of bad humour that Caroline is indulging in, switches to French to call her having a lot of l'esprit mordant and caustique. So I think you're right in thinking that there's a kind of developing middle class British sensibility versus what's sort of placed onto the continent, but it's also something that is predominating at the moment in Caroline's character. So it's a sort of it's a critique of the socializing that Caroline has experienced as a kind of spoilt society girl, and the process of the rural walks that she's going for, and the rambles farther in the sequel, are kind of refining her in a British sense, I suppose, away from that spirit to a spirit which is still ridiculing and is still ridiculous, but is sort of defined differently. Like the ridicule of the Hamertons is kind of implicitly and explicitly supported by Mrs. Woodfield through sort of in the extracts that you can read from in the homework. Mrs. Woodfield is also ridiculing Mrs. Hamerton. So there's a sort of there's a mordant and caustic humour that is acceptable, and I would suggest it's sort of when directed at kind of justifiable, it's directed justifiably at pretentiousness, whereas the attacks on someone who is of a lower social status than the Woodfields and Caroline is told off by is where Caroline gets told off by the Woodfields. But perhaps Felicity, having listened to my ramble, has some thoughts about the playful humour of the Lambs.
It's a really good question, because I do think that humor is so important in the poetry, perhaps stemming from their original entrance into writing for children, the nursery rhyme format, the sort of chapbook, quite subversive rhymes of the King and Queen of Hearts. But then you're quite right that Mrs. Leicester's School isn't primarily a humorous book at all. It's much more about grief and isolation. And you're really making me think about the different modes that the Lambs use. I think there is a gentle humour in Mrs. Leicester's School, which is a lovely collection of stories that all these little girls tell one another. It's very much about children sharing their stories. And they've all just come to boarding school and they share their life stories. And I'm going to think some more about why there isn't the same sort of emphasis on humour in Mrs. Leicester's School, particularly in light of what comes out in your own study about didacticism and the role of humour in didacticism. It seems to me to be much more important in their poetry than in any of their prose works for children. But thanks, Donnell. It's so good to have you here, if a little intimidating, and really nice to have that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. Would anyone else sort of, I think play and humour sort of came into other people's presentations, and would anyone else like to open up out on the panel and think about play and humour in relation to what they spoke about? And I'm sort of, it's like an open mic time for people to sort of speak if they wish.
Something sort of to add to that. This isn't about what I spoke about. It's sort of another sort of question for Felicity and Andy. And when you were speaking, Felicity, I was thinking about a quotation that Andy used in the first table talk from Jean-Paul Richter about a comic juxtaposition of perspectives based on a failure of understanding. And I was just wondering how you thought that sort of might play out in in the Lambs children's literature, maybe children's literature more generally, and then just things like you were saying about there being a background undertone of war and grief to all these things. I mean, that seems like a juxtaposition of perspectives, maybe not a comic one. So
Yes, that's a lovely question, comment, Mary-Lise. And I'm wondering whether it does come back. Partly I'm wondering whether one of the answers to Donnell could be that in Mrs. Leicester's School, it is the children themselves who are the narrators. Whereas in the poetry for children, it's for a child reader, but primarily we're sort of seeing the children. And I think they're always very they're very cautious not to mock the child's perspective, to enter into it empathetically. And of course, perhaps some of that comes from the ways in which the lambs had experienced social difficulties. We're in a manner marked, Charles Lamb writes about Mary's situation, and we're very conscious of the ways in which the vulnerable might be looked at or might be mocked.
Thank you so much for that question, Mary-Lise. It's lovely to sort of bring it back to Richter and that idea about the juxtaposition of perspectives leading to new understanding. Made me think back about my own, that sort of division between Caroline's earlier mockery of the person who sort of doesn't know she's ridiculous, and then her mockery of someone who perhaps should know that she's making herself ridiculous. I think might be a distinction that I'd like to think about a little bit more, so that Mrs. Woodfield tells her off about the earlier ridicule, because the person who's being ridiculed has sort of such a lack of awareness of herself that there's no possibility of a kind of a lesson being learned there on either Caroline's part or the person that Caroline is ridiculing, whereas Mrs. Hamilton is a justifiable target of ridicule because she should somehow know better. And I think that's an interesting, I think it's quite a sort of, it's quite a sharp understanding of ridiculousness that Smith is developing in her child characters, that it seems to be different from what's going on in what Felicity is talking about from Mrs. Lester's school. But that you're reminding me of Richter made me think about that kind of the way he thinks about awareness, and then sort of who is aware and who is being made aware, and how can they be made aware in that children's writing, I think is something that I'm now going to have to go away and think about. Fantastic, thank you so much. We have there's a question that got answered by Rita, but Rita was actually asking her own question, so I'm going to switch to the answered questions, and we'll start with Alison, go to Rita, and then I think we have another one from Danelle, unless others of you get your chance in to sort of write some questions. But Alison said, thank you so much to all the speakers for a collection of fantastic papers. I've got a question about pin money. I'm currently writing a chapter located at the other end of the century on the South Sea Bubble and Hayward, and one of the themes there is that women were using their pin money to buy stocks and thus get rich with their separate property and evade the control of their husbands. I'm wondering how pin money and separate property more generally is treated in the novel over 100 years later. Thank you. I can see why Rita may have replied to that as well, but Corinna, would you like to think about Alison's question?
Absolutely, and Rita's question is very similar as well, because she's asking about women and property. It was a question, not an answer, I think. It's interesting because actually 100 years later, Gore is not as progressive as we might hope. She is actually very much against the idea of a separate allowance in the end, and the book is basically a sort of object lesson in itself to illustrate the dangers of a couple not knowing what each other is spending on. There's one moment where they both commission a fountain for the grounds of their estate, and it gets really funny and complicated. And there's one point where the wife is having a portrait of herself painted and the husband knows nothing about it because he's not signing off on the bills, so ends up thinking she's having an affair, even though they've only been married for a couple of months, so it's all quite ridiculous. But the basic message at the end is that it's all been her aunt's fault for insisting that she had a separate settlement, and they'd have been much better to have both known what expenditure was going out of the family. So quite a different attitude altogether, really.
Oops, sorry, I managed to be on mute as well as all my other flaws. Thanks so much, Corinna. And thank you to Alison and Rita for those questions that got us to think about some things at the heart of what was going on there. I'm going to skip Danelle and then maybe come back to you and let some other people ask some questions. So I know has one which says, I thought it was interesting in rural walks that Mrs. Woodfield ridicules the preference of some titled people for any company at all, be it to laugh at them, while in, for example, Edgeworth's Ormond, the narrator insists on the fact that in isolation a gentry lady character was in vulgar company, but that was acceptable because some company must be had, thus illustrating the value of sociability per se. Okay, I'm not sure if there's, even though it says Q&A, I'm not sure if there's a sort of, if there's necessarily a question there, just to sort of note that it's interesting, and that Smith is thinking about the allowability of ridicule, whereas Ormond, I think I think I'm sort of understanding you that there's Smith is a sort of attacking or is sort of criticizing that that sort of mixed sociability, and Ormond is allowing it. Yes, is that right? If you want to reply, then we could get to the bottom of what's going on there. I know. And Alison says that's so interesting. Thank you. We'll wait while maybe typing is going on. Yes. Okay. I'm going to take that as I've successfully answered that question, and then switch back to Danelle, who says, I don't want to ask too many questions, but ... Merylise, loved your talk. The first passage you quote referred to individuals who chase shadows. And of course, I automatically think of the allegory of the cave and shadows versus forms, which leads me to ask if you are thinking of shadows/forms in your analysis of how the objects modelled in Wollstonecraft here are multifaceted, at once epistemological, social, sexual, and ontological. Merylise, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think definitely there's Platonism in the text. I mean, it's sort of a romantic Platonism, I would say, where romantic means something like a stress on the imagination. So it's the imagination for Wollstonecraft that can raise the passions out of the common stream of society into something more. Yeah, although that aspect I'm suggesting is that the societal aspect is her focus, but I think there certainly is a form of Platonism there, but the focus is on the sort of mediating power of the imagination, I think.
Fab. Well, I was thinking the other direction from Plato for you, Merylise, and thinking about how sort of object lessons and object choice relates to sort of later psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic forms. Like, there's obviously the Kleinian model, but thinking about when you talk about children, and I was thinking about children's play, I wondered about D.W. Winnicott and his ideas about children, and I wondered if sort of, I don't know where I didn't have this formulated as a question. I've just dive straight in, but maybe sort of like, how is Wollstonecraft thinking about child psychology, or how does her thinking about child psychology lead her to think about kind of her own or sort of utopian forms of psychology, I suppose.
It's a really interesting one. I mean, my sort of, what I was going to get across is that there's in this text, and probably lots of other ones in the Romantic period, there's a kind of flickering, a conceptual flickering going on around the idea of objects, and they have it with multiple dimensions. One of them definitely in this text, I think, is Platonic, but also proto-psychoanalytic. Absolutely, I think that is there too. Interestingly, I think actually in the whole text, he doesn't talk as much about child psychology as you would think, considering she is attacking Emile by Rousseau, which is huge. A huge amount of that is about that. So she in that passage where the thing I had, all the experiences of an infant can obtain, who does certain things that cannot tell why. So definitely the kind of object lessons that she's describing is aimed to foster a kind of awareness, a self-awareness, in the growing mind, where you can get a sense of why it might be doing things. The point is to, you know, align it to these greater sort of goals of virtue and thinking about the higher states and things like higher state of God and everything. Yeah, so it's very much a kind of trajectory, or like a trajectory she hopes the unformed mind can take, but not by totally sublimating everything, by being really honest about what these societal passions are. There's a bit where she says it would have been better for somebody to have experienced physical love than have been purely idealizing their object. So that reality of passion is important to you.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Yeah, really thoughtful answer, Marylise, and I really enjoyed your paper, and it sort of made me think about Wollstonecraft sort of afresh, which is the whole point of this sort of evening. I noticed that in the answered section, Adam has a question for Felicity, and hopefully we can sort of also turn this into a question for Adam as well. So I have an additional question to ask on the children's literature, specifically for Felicity. Adam, as you're here and already a face and can speak, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I may as well. I just wanted to give a bit of a forward notice because I quote some of the things, and I wasn't quite sure what some of the titles of the books were that Felicity showed us, but I'm assuming that she's aware which one I mean. I think it was her first image of the storybook, which showed some children stealing something. Maybe she'll be able to get that back up. And yeah, I was just kind of wondering, are they blackened for a reason?
I'll just see if I can share that. And actually this is a yeah, it's an excellent question, Adam. I don't have an answer for you, but it's a really good point. There's a he introduces into the narrative a little African boy, slave, Pambo. And I'm not entirely sure what the significance of this is, but I know it is significant because he is so interested. He works for the East India House, of course. He's very conscious of the sort of colonial underpinnings of London life, I would say. And the image of the little black boy comes up again and again, often linked to the chimney sweep. But here linked to slavery or linked to this exotic luxury image as well, I think. And the two come together when he is asked to submit a piece for an abolitionist anthology, and he recommends one of Blake's chimney sweep poems, but he alters it slightly, and he talks that at that point he talks about the link between his chimney sweeps and slaves. So I don't know, but I'm really interested to think about that further and to think about the presence of the colonial in Lamb's work. It's always there, but it's around the edges. It's sort of the unspoken, just like the East India House paper he often writes on, and he takes the scraps of it and saves it, and he facilitates romantic correspondence by using India House postage illicitly, and it's sort of channeled through, but it's an unspoken presence there. In Queen Oriana's Dream, I think that's coming directly from the Jacobean work he's looking at, and he's often interested in portrayals of slavery in the specimens as well. So I don't think it's purely incidental, but I don't have a good sound reason for what exactly is going on there, Adam. And I'm also interested to think about it as a subtext in Woodhouse's work. I noticed the India bonds that are financing the changing landscape, the groves, and and landscape improvements that are going on. Do you want to say any more about that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point as well. I think Wodehouse was certainly aware of all those, these subjects that were going on at the time. And of course, Montagu's grandson was an early abolitionist, and Montagu herself lent some statements of support to anti-slavery eventually, although some of her earlier statements seem to work in the opposite. She compares, for example, some of her miners to blacks, and uses these kind of these comparisons that suggest kind of her idea of internal colonies as well as external ones. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in terms of the kind of global and colonial context of Wodehouse's life and the poem, but they're all very tangential. But the interesting things that I think that you point to in the passage, some of the passages I think which are in the homework about being transmuted into India bonds, he seems really conscious of global empire, and the ways in which forms of exploration abroad seem to parallel things that are going on in Britain as well. And he tentatively describes some of those things. The curious area with Wodehouse, and this is something I'm working on in the future, is that although he seems somewhat anti-imperialist, he writes very unusually about Africans themselves, and often compares himself to a slave under Montagu's employment. And there's a certain level of kind of invidious comparison there where he says, his suffering is worse than that of slaves. So there's some really interesting parallels that he's kind of drawing there between his condition, the condition of colonized others, the way, and the way in which land is also operating within that. But it's not, at the same time, it's not completely kind of progressive, and there are some really difficult elements to it that I hope to be able to talk about in the future when I do some more on Wodehouse.
Fantastic.
And
Thanks.
just,
Thanks, Adam.
yeah,
Oh,
yes, on the subject of difficulty, I was just thinking about the unsettling and strange essays and comments from Lamb, like Imperfect Sympathies, things that I find really hard to determine, hard to talk about. And I think I need to bring those into the foreground. So thanks, Adam, for pointing that out and bringing it up as a subject of discussion. Great.
Yeah, thanks both for those fantastic answers and for sort of working together to sort of tease out the connections between them. As we have no open questions at the moment, although I see that there's a question for Anne-Claire in the chat from Corinna, which I'll try and roll into my own, because I had a question for Anne-Claire, a question for everybody, because I think it would be nice to sort of have one that tries to tie us all together somehow, and then a question specifically for Adam, which we might end on if we run out of other questions from you. But those of you who've managed to remain after our advertised closing time, as we started so late, thank you so much. And if you have any other questions, get them in to us as soon as you can. But my question for Anne-Claire, so first I'll roll it in with Corinna. So Corinna says, I have a question about the conflict between friendship and the marital relationship in the poem you shared. I'm curious, as these don't seem to be emotions that should conflict, and wondered why you think it's portrayed this way. Are there echoes of this elsewhere in OP's writing? And I'm going to link that to what I wanted to ask, because I was interested in the kind of relationship you were discussing between OP, Mrs. Twiss, and John OP. So Amelia OP, Mrs. Twiss, and John OP. And I wondered if there was a sort of a kind of sort of advanced flipping of the male gaze there, and something that was going on, like something that was being sort of forged between women, and you spoke really interestingly about female friendship. So I suppose it gets us back into tensions between, is there a tension between female friendships and male-female love in the poem, which I think sort of makes my question into Corinna's question again somehow.
Sure. Well, I guess your point does suggest that the kind of the male gaze is kind of elided in that. Perhaps first to answer Corinna's question, there are lots of gift poems in OP's work, and in a couple that she wrote for Elizabeth Lemestre's birthday, one of them does talk about sort of the husband kind of features in, and sort of the tension between the love of the husband, what the husband kind of represents for Lemestre. I can't remember the exact words, I'm afraid, so my answer is a bit fuzzy, but I thought it was interesting that in that birthday poem, the marital relationship was also, and the husband's position, as it were, was also kind of woven in that poem. And Andy, sorry, what was your question again? Sorry.
it was a convoluted question. It was about so thinking about either the male gaze or Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's work about between men. Is there sort of something going on similarly between women in Opie's writing, where sort of Opie is sort of cathected to or connected to Miss Twist through the painting in a way that sort of becomes, is given extra significance through the interdependence between painting and poem that you talked about?
Yeah, you see that replicated, I suppose, in the poem on that painting in Lays for the Dead, as I mentioned towards the end of my talk. But I think that also it does bring in the fact that they're all friends as well. And maybe this sounds a little bit naff, but the fact that they are all connected, and they all met in kind of, they all sort of married through kind of, socializing with each other. And so you have, so it's both, it's not really foregrounded in the poem, but the kind of the situation as a whole brings in John Opie's friendship as well with both Francis Twisses. And I think the poem, the fact that it sort of features in a way at the beginning of Opie's career and towards the end as well, really shows the importance of the painting and of a visual representation to memory and to commemorating friendship. And so that's what I was trying to explore a little bit as well in that talk, is the importance of the visual representation as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for handling my very sort of convoluted question. My question to everyone, I think, is more straightforward. So this is a sort of open question that anyone is welcome to answer. But I thought that sort of all of our papers this evening have been thinking about sort of, because they're thinking about the social, they're thinking about relations and about the relationships and how those relationships are sort of multiply connected, which kind of takes us on from what Anne-Claire was saying about the kind of network of relationships that is visible in that poem. And it's a sort of open question for anyone to take on board, to sort of think about how are relationships represented as sort of networked or connected in the piece of writing that you are interested in, or as a reflection on any other person's piece of writing that they've brought up. So sort of anyone can sort of either raise their hand or butt in by unmuting themselves and just give an answer about the significance of relationships in romantic ideas about sociability or society. Hopefully someone has some thoughts about this, or I'm going to have to answer my own question, which is always a dreadful thing to be able to do.
Just a very quick one for me, sort of follows on to what I was saying before, that the relationships that I think Wolfenbach is talking about is with yourself and some kind of higher version of your own, hopefully virtuous trajectory, and she sort of tries to handle that shift of focus in the passage that I spoke about in the moment where she says she must descend from her height and into the common stream of society. So she's sort of aware there's this sort of pull focus out into society and back. But society proves in the text, I think, maybe more unmanageably large, in the object and how they get to virtual things than maybe you would expect.
Thanks, Mary-Lise. Anybody else would like to sort of give an answer? I like that idea about when you were talking in your talk, when you think about the sort of the significance of the imagination and also the imaginary for Wollstonecraft. I thought that was really interesting, and kind of imaginary relationships are something sort of interesting to think about in the Romantic period in particular, I think.
I can add something on that. It might be a slightly different, because obviously so much of what Wodehouse was doing in his autobiography was so kind of hidden and closeted that there's not much. This feels like very much an isolated work that's produced very privately, and there's not that sense of kind of interaction with other people in the immediate time. But there's plenty of reflection of ideas about sociability, and what Steve Van Hagen's thought about with Wodehouse as a kind of expert in sociability, in terms of his ability to just transcend and socialize with different classes, ones above him, whether they be people like the Shenstone at Lisos or aristocrats, through poetry, ultimately through an appreciation of poetry and landscape, to actually find common ground. And that's the kind of tension sometimes in his work, because he's very grateful to certain individuals who helped him on this way. But then also his whole journey in his life is punctuated by these moments of violence, when those nice relationships are seen as just isolated incidents. So I think he really, one of the main struggles in the work is to balance a formidable social critique of class structure with an appreciation of the actual personal relationships that he managed to make outside of those kind of class boundaries in those moments where he was able to.
Fantastic, thanks. I have a question that I'm not. I'll kind of air Adam, but I don't want you to answer, because I want to go to Adam Nyquirk, the other Adam, who's getting a couple of questions in the chat, and I did say I had a question that in mind for him. But I was really struck by the opening line that you started with from the poem, about which moved from I think rustic sonnets to raving yells, and I think that says something really interestingly about the kind of poetic technique and the poetic aesthetics that Wodehouse is kind of grappling with, that I found really interesting. But I'm gonna let's pick up on that in another fora, because we're going to run out of time shortly. And I've noticed a couple of comments coming to Adam about the sort of tensions between the creative and the critical, and sort of interest in hearing about your creative work. And I confess that I've been on the back foot ever since I put the wrong time into this event, but I was also wrong-footed because I was hoping to hear some of your poem, Adam Nyquirk, read out, and I've prepped you privately in the comments to sort of maybe climax the evening on a bit of a poetry reading from Adam, who we haven't heard from so far in this segment, but I think it would be lovely to hear a bit of your Coleridge biography to sort of round us off, if that's okay.
Thank you, Andy. So I will talk very, very briefly about Felicity's question, because it's really hard to answer. But I will say I agree that I think that it feels like something that has, to use a kind of Hegelian term, has some synthetic power when you start to put these ways of thinking together. And what it kind of comes down to is that you're looking at texts, right, which is a kind of critical activity, looking at romantic texts. And then you're also saying, like, well, how do I produce a romantic text? And what sort of things are going into the problem for me, right? And am I sort of like, am I writing myself? Is there any way to sort of escape the self as you're working in poetry? Or is there some way to kind of like dress it up with enough like sort of Coleridgean trappings that you get away from that, or that you get away from 2021? Do you get away from the pandemic? Did it help me write that I was stuck inside all the time and that, didn't get to go to the places I wanted to go? So there's this sort of unavoidable fusion, right, of all these different things, which is just a really vague way of saying that I know it's a complex it's a complex process. But all I can say is that it's been kind of amazing in a way. It's hard to describe it in a way that's detached from it. But like being able to kind of, you get these moments where you go beyond, you know, sometimes I'll start versifying something from his notebooks, right? Cutting it up into pentameter lines. And you start to do that. And then you start to change the lines to make it fit, because oh, he's like, that doesn't sound as good. Let's fix this. And you kind of change his writing around. And you start to feel like, I don't know, that there's this kind of line running through his work, even his stuff that's in his notebooks that most people don't know about, you know, where there's this pulse of like that flight that you try to get to as a poet. Like there's this sort of sense that you're sort of flapping your wings every time you're trying to make a sound that sounds the same, or a meter that sounds nice. You're kind of flapping and trying to get off the ground. You kind of want to take the readers with you. And I think that, I don't know, you know what, let me just read the poem so we don't run out of time. So I have it here on the paper, and it's a little bit cut up, so I'll do a little bit of scrolling, but this is called Gated. Oh, I went to the top. Hold on. And it's basically Coleridge kind of writing a bit to his brother, but he's kind of ranting about his situation. So, the illusions of this campus bring me no sense of life's grand illusion that so buffets the living, advantaged and disadvantaged both, that propels them through the storm and dark array, the threatening thunderhead, the chilling sight of empty fields long stretching far away, the empty field, the grass trod underneath, the bare-boughed tree not sheltered from the cold by its long-fallen grovelings, twined away and pruned by workmen's tools, the slummy road that winds between two hedgerows, winter-sparred, and the narrow alley where, when one long lingers in its faint beckoning grasp, one hears the sounds of inarticulate life, the wheels of joy, the frowns of daily disappoint, and the resounding clink of the arm that lifts the tankard up to drink. How many times have I, when skulking out from Cambridge, getting away to London to travel, stood in the desolate places in the worst bits of the undeveloped parts of town, stood near some open window looking in on a merry scene that survives the oppressing din, but feeling then as if I were looking out at the world from deep within my skull. Oh, the mind is a sea, and through it breakers roll. Oh, thinking then of Bowles, or the elegy of Thomas Gray, or the night thoughts of Ed Young, poets, but not like me by life undone, but turning their melancholy into cheering works, works long of thought intense and expressive feeling, that bring us closer to peruse when day is fading into its opposite starry dome. I have tried, oh brother, I have tried like them to work some odd of good from this foregone conclusion of my own beautiful worthlessness, have labored when the madness fit is done, to surface from its waters, and after a song of deep and needful breaths of clear air, wring something from the soaking clothes I wear, and redeem myself. Oh, but that requires that I let myself be redeemed. I cannot seem to brook that master in my ownmost soul. Now dawns and friendly teachers pin me in to Jesus College and tell me where to go. I have all drink forsworn, and I cannot leave these grounds, O brother. I know I would deceive myself and visit the alleyways again. I am given, like Socrates, a day or night's reprieve, a little time among disciples, but must, like him, refuse their sympathies and pledge myself to Athens, for whom I die. Yet what has been my crime? I sought to corrupt someone enough to love me, that is all. But why do I need love? Why do I need, with an intensity that makes my brain, my heart, my skin even, bleed, sweat, and panting matter, some eternal self-avowor who is not me? Or world I renounce, where eye looks out for eye? I cannot bear to think of it this way. Selves and their strong machines, homunculi, who regularly, for incidents and leisure, drive their machines out to the sunny bay, or sun themselves on hillsides in good weather, careening by in carriages they hired, driven, perhaps, by selves that are like them. They lay in mobile caves and drink the dim and huddle in perfect units without a spark of creativity. Their names are all. My name is nothing. What care I that it shines? To see them gathered round a building of ritual meter, all working to clean it, and then I look on mine, a pest house near a workhouse, 10 by 10, or even smaller, small coffin pre-designed. Did you, O brother, pace in our own halls when father laid upon his anodyne? I see myself a rattler in a cage, a rolling ball with tiny homeless spokes that rolls about the spaces of that cage and clinks the bars and makes a merry sound. I wanted to be Silas in the ground, beneath the earth, to sleep for once and ever, from name and title, if title I'd had, to sever myself, to be no son or brother, no debt upon your hearts, or on my mother's. Another soldier, taken from the crowd, the ever-anxious crowd that flees the tide of liberty and revolution, and in so doing locks itself inside an outsized mobile jail, when he is thrown from his horse, who never learned a self to ride. He breaks his neck, and for a few more moments stares wildly at clouds, Aeolus's hide, then dies beneath a tree still bare in winter's retreat. My body is never found. Or should I say, his body is misplaced as mine is named. No one need hurt at my own senseless death. Anonymous chases your pains away and makes them senseless as the poet's breath, which like a wind, a choiceless, will-less current, flows into everything and makes it dance. All lively shapes, or wriggle to the sway of the music he breathed from his arid lamp. A fonder lamp spots inky wisps of shade upon all the world and sees a fresh-made page on the cusp of every tome, each scrap of thought, nor new nor old is only life forgot, to be remembered and enjoyed again, even death, even loss and suffering, so tragic, it humors us with its surfeit of magic. Oh, bury me, bury the lead of my soul in mock catastrophe and melancholia. No more my name to be, no more inherit, nor fortune, nor esteem, nor merit. Gone, just gone. But then, how could you guess I felt this way and heaved this emptiness? I have found my mark for when this punishment is over. I expect with good behavior it will be soon. I'm often spotted through my open window, strategically at study in my room, and burning a candle long into the night when the entire sky around is soft and blue and the distant stars are twinkling like the scholar's eye. His name is Joseph Hucks. I know he is in favor with the college. I know he is a favorite of Tuckett's and even was a favorite of Bowyer's when he was a good boy at Christ's Hospital. I know he is proud of his new station here at Cam, how he bedecks himself in fashionable clothes and feels himself a feather in the cap of this fine place, the pride of all the proud. It is him I will take with me when I go. Oh, brother, burn this letter. 'Tis only you I'd write such things to. Pray you, let it burn. But do not believe I'll stay a moment longer than this punishment, due punishment, I've earned. I will go a-walking, for that is what men do in my station in life, to share the world of those who will never see it, who will never know what it means to write a letter and ask it burned. We'll do those things. We'll be homunculi, with our bodies on green grass in sunny weather, laying side by side on mountainous hills and haunting roadways where the paupers saunter. Old men and women speak lightly of the chill from the retreating winter, and comely maids go by with washing balanced on their brows. A bucolic place where war yet moves the crowd in her rolling dungeon along its winding way, holds all of England with the gentle murmur of distant cannon fire, and cuts the glades of the disadvantaged in the light of day. We'll stand, two trees alone on some deep space, willing our tuffets of leaves to brightly show. With outstretched arms, we'll greet the comely maidens and write them letters, silent, that we'll throw like paper airplanes toward oblivious friends. Oh, Hucks will write. He cannot round a bend and not upon some lovely sight portend, impressing distant people with his tales and the rustic humors of the high Welsh light, which sings atop the fluffy clouds of white. And he will write of me, his chidden companion, who now, a man with sober purpose, slights the many and frequent vice temptations, but through the countryside on wheels refurbished, will like the savor of a swordsman perished, through hill and dale, through meadow, valley, slice, a wild scimitar, a whirling dervish, a sunny soul enshrouded in black ice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. I think that was a rousing conclusion to our event. If I can just hold the 15 attendees who are still with us for a moment. I said I was going to go back to one last screen. Let's see if I can do it. That's not the screen I wanted. This was the screen I wanted. So yes, just to advertise the next event. So thank you all for coming to this one. And just to say that in around Christmas time, so as a sort of Christmas gift to you all, we'll be reconvening for Table Talks 3, New Approaches to Romantic Studies and Childhood. And that's going to feature a conversation between me and Rita, who's been sort of sitting in on this one and tweeting prodigiously. And that's going to have a theme of childhood, adolescence. And I think both we've sort of discovered that childhood and adolescence have their own share of ridiculousness this evening, so sort of keep your eye out for the next one. And the image of Cher in Clueless is to sort of advertise its the fact that we can sort of think beyond the romantic period towards remediation and adaptation, where Clueless is the best adaptation of Emma that you might experience, but also thinks about adolescence in particular in a way that may take us back to thinking about Austen interestingly. And I know that's something that Rita is particularly keen on thinking about, and perhaps that post image will encourage other people to think about the legacies of romanticism, as well as how romantic writers themselves thought about childhood and adolescence, a taster of which Felicity and I have hopefully given you tonight. But I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you to Adam for finishing us off so lovelily with a poetry reading. Thank you to the other 4 early career researchers for some really wonderful and thought-provoking papers. And thank you for my keynote, Felicity, for some fantastic work on Charles and Mary Lamb. A sort of round of applause again from me to you all. That was fantastic. And hopefully these conversations can develop over the coming months and years. Hopefully, I think these are sort of fascinating. This is fascinating material that we've developed. Thank you so much. I think we're well past time to finish. Go and have a well-earned rest. Anne Claire looks like she's been plunged into absolute darkness, so is ready to go.
It's just because obviously I'm an hour ahead, so it's yeah, the sun is setting. But and the light switch was too far, and I didn't want to leave during the reading, so yeah, then night descended on me.
Wow. On the note of night descending, and thinking about what Adam described as emo Coleridge, and is an image that I'm going to sort of take away with me. We will go like emo Coleridge into the night and think our own thoughts. Goodbye, and thank you very much. I will stop recording.